Hey, and welcome back. This is James Knight here with Fantasy Football Week 2 Offensive Player Rankings for IDP Plus. With 1 week officially wrapped up, I've got some more information on who I like this week, who I want to start, and a couple of fades. Stick around and find out. So, a few quick reminders. Stats are based on PPR, and most of my recommendations are based on 12-team leagues, some 10-team, 14, but mostly around 12-team PPR leagues. One quarterback, but I will touch on some two quarterback stuff occasionally. I'm going to highlight a few key players at each offensive position: quarterback, running back, wide receiver, and tight end. Give a few insights on who I like the most. Highlight basically a couple players from each one of the positions, and then let you know why I think they're higher in my rankings than they are in most consensus top 12 rankings. So let's go ahead and dig right in and see what we've got going on this week. Week 1 was chaos. We know that. So last week, out of the top 12 that we listed for quarterback rankings, I hit 6 of 12 on those, including the number one overall, Josh Allen. Thought that was going to be a shootout. It turned out to be a huge classic, instant classic, if you will, Buffalo and Baltimore. I also hit on Caleb Williams, who last night had a pretty good game. He managed to get into the top 10 this week, or last week as well. The fade quarterback that I had last week, I faded Jared Goff. And of course, he finished his QB 21. So I figure that's a pretty good hit there as well. Let's get on to this week's rankings for week number 2. At the top spot, again this week, I'm going to go with Josh Allen. He's at the New York Jets this week. He was QB1 last week, so he's number 1. Number 2, Lamar Jackson. He is at home in Baltimore versus the Cleveland Browns this week, and he was QB4 last week. At number 3 this week, we have Jalen Hurts, who's visiting Kansas City in a Super Bowl rematch against the Chiefs. He ended up as QB8 last week. At number 4, I know he bombed last week and was QB28, but I'm gonna go with Joe Burrow at home versus the Jacksonville Jaguars. At number 5, Justin Herbert. He is visiting the Las Vegas Raiders this week and was QB5 last week. At number 6, Jaden Daniels. He's going to visit Green Bay this week as the Commanders look to take down the Packers. He was also QB13 last week. At number 7 this week, I've got Baker Mayfield, who's visiting Houston along with the Buccaneers, and he finished at QB12 last week. At number 8, I've got Patrick Mahomes versus the Philadelphia Eagles. And like I said, rematch of the Super Bowl. It's going to be at home in Kansas City. And Mahomes was QB6 last week. At number 9, I've got Bo Nix visiting the Indianapolis Colts. The Broncos are going to look to, stay on track there. They won against Tennessee last week, and Bo was QB27. Had a few issues, but yeah. At number 10 this week, I've got Caleb Williams back in the top 12 again. He's visiting Detroit Lions in a divisional matchup for the Chicago Bears, and he looked pretty good in the first half last night, finished up with a top 12 QB1 game. He was QB9 last week. At number 11 this week, I've got Kyler Murray, who's at home in Arizona versus the Carolina Panthers. He was QB16 last week. At number 12, pop-up surprise in the rankings, I've got Justin Fields, who is at home in New York versus the Buffalo Bills in a QB matchup with Josh Allen, our QB1, which ironically, Justin Fields was QB2 last week. So a couple of pieces on here that I think I'm higher on than most consensus rankings. My first guy is the number 5 QB this week. I've got Justin Herbert. The Chargers are visiting Las Vegas to play against the Raiders, and Herbert was already QB5 last week. He's one of my biggest movers this week, jumping up the list. We've always known his pedigree. We knew what kind of skills he had. And last week, Jim Harbaugh and the Chargers shocked the world and unlocked him and let him throw the ball everywhere. He threw for 318 yards, 3 touchdowns, and tacked on another 32 yards rushing. So he's locked and loaded as a QB1 this week against a very, very vulnerable Las Vegas Raiders defense, and I think he'll be a top 5 at QB5. Another player, I'm going back to the well like I did last week. I'm still a firm believer. He had a rough week. I mentioned that a minute ago, is Bo Nix. Him and the Denver Broncos are visiting the Indianapolis Colts this week to pay a visit to Danny Dimes, Mr. Daniel Jones, or as some people are calling him now, Indiana Jones. Daniel Jones was phenomenal last week as a quarterback and shot up and was an actual QB1 towards the top of the rankings, depending on your settings. So Bo Nix is playing there, but I'm back in on him this week, despite the rough outing at Tennessee. I think the Titans defense is sneakily better than people give them credit for. And, I just really, really, really think that the Indianapolis defense is not nearly as good as the dumpster fire that the Miami Dolphins made them look like last week. Nix, on top of that, had 8 rushing attempts, which puts him right up there in that upper echelon of rushing quarterbacks. You've got Jaden Daniels and Lamar Jackson and Josh Allen, and these guys get designed runs. And we know that Konami cheat code, getting rushing production from your quarterback gets you in the QB1 rankings. And I've got Bo at quarterback 9 this week. For my fade this week, I thought about this. I bounced around a couple of names. I wasn't exactly sure who I wanted to put here, but I'm going to fade Dak Prescott this week for the Dallas Cowboys. He's going to be at home. It's a home game against the New York Giants. Prescott last week in a primetime matchup, first game of the season, had the Philadelphia Eagles. He ended up as QB 29 on the week, and that's pretty rough. For all intents purposes, the Giants slightly held Jaden Daniels in check. They actually ended up knocking him out of the QB1 ranks, where he finished as QB 13 last week. So that's pretty low for Jaden Daniels. You expect him to be a top 5 quarterback, but I think the Giants' front 7 is for real. They get after the quarterback, Brian Burns, Carter. There's a whole gang of them that rotate in and constantly pressure the quarterback. As a matter of fact, they got Jaden Daniels, who is extremely mobile, for 3 sacks last week. I think they're going to get Prescott. They're going to have him trying to get rid of the ball quick, throw the whole Cowboys offense off, and I think we see another rough outing for the Cowboys offense and Dak Prescott. Moving on to running back. Last week, ironically, just like the quarterbacks, we hit 6 of 12 going through what we had. Within my top 12, I did have the number 1, number 2, and number 3 overall finishers on the week. A special hit on that, kind of like getting Caleb in the quarterback section, was I had Travis Etienne listed as my number 12 running back last week. If you play Travis Etienne, you definitely got a win last week. He was RB6 on the week. So a huge game for him, and it was good to see that. We also faded Tony Pollard last week. Tony Pollard was playing against Denver, and of course the Denver defense came through, held him. He finished as RB33, so that was an excellent fade play for most top 12s. Moving on to the actual top 12 list for week 2 for running backs. At number 1 is Christian McCaffrey. Him and the San Francisco 49ers are heading to New Orleans to play the Saints. The Saints are picked to be one of the worst teams in the NFL this year. They showed next to no fight this past week, and they had Spencer Rattler throw the ball a ton, but McCaffrey's just number 1. There's not a whole lot of reason to argue that. Number 2, Jahmyr Gibbs at home for the Detroit Lions against Chicago. He was RB13 last week, and McCaffrey before him was RB3. Moving on to number 3 for this week. I've got Bucky Irving from the Tampa Bay Buccaneers at Houston Texans. He finished as RB15 last week. Number 4, Devon Achane versus New England. The Dolphins will be at home, and I think, if anybody looked decent last week, it was Achane. He finished as RB10. So I've got him at RB4 this week. At RB5, I've got Bijan Robinson. Him and the Atlanta Falcons are heading to Minnesota to play the Vikings, and Bijan finished RB2 last week. At number 6, I've got a personal favorite of mine, James Cook. As the Buffalo Bills visit the New York Jets, Cook finished RB4 last week. At number 7 this week for the running backs, it's Saquon Barkley. That feels a little low for him, but he's at Kansas City. Great pass rushing defense. They're notorious for it. Barkley finished as RB7 last week against Dallas, and I've got him at RB7 again this week. At number 8, he was in my top 12 last week. I don't think many other people had him there. I've got Travis Etienne at number 8 this week as the Jacksonville Jaguars head to Cincinnati. And like I said before, ETN finished as RB6 last week. At number 9 this week, I've got Chase Brown as the Cincinnati Bengals are at home versus Jacksonville. Chase Brown was RB22 last week, but he saw the field a ton. So I think, he's a strong top 12 running back. At number 10 this week, I've got Josh Jacobs at home in Green Bay versus the Washington Commanders. Last week, Josh Jacobs was RB18. At number 11, I've got the King, Derrick Henry, at home versus the Cleveland Browns. And Derrick Henry proved he was the king again last week as RB1. At number 12, I've got James Conner, who's up against the Carolina Panthers this week. He was RB16 last week. I want to touch on, like I said, a couple of the guys that I've got obviously higher than consensus. I mentioned he's my guy. It's James Cook. I've got him at RB6 this week. It's against the New York Jets, and it's in New York. And, prototypically, people kind of think about the Jets as being a pretty strong defense. Last week, we saw them uncharacteristically get into a shootout with the Pittsburgh Steelers. Aaron Rodgers threw 4 touchdowns. They didn't have a huge run game, but there was a lot of openings in the run game. That there was some passing in there. And Cook came through last week. Like I said, he was RB4. He had 102 total yards and a touchdown. Finished with 20.4 points. Out of those points, he got 5 receptions for 58 yards, which showcased a usage that I think the Bills have been wanting to kind of push towards him. He lobbied them for it when he signed his new contract, saying, I want to get more involved and be more involved in the passing game and other things like that. He wants a full workload. And I think this past week, over 100 yards, 58 of those receiving, showed off his big play ability with a 51-yard reception that almost went for a touchdown. So the Jets aren't as imposing as they have been in years past, and I'm willing to bet that Cook finds the end zone again this week. Another running back, similar type of back, I feel like, is the guy I hit on last week in the top 12 and put him at 12. I've got him at 8 this week, and it's Travis Etienne. He's visiting Cincinnati, and the Jaguars' offense kind of stuttered a little bit. There's some speculation about whether Lawrence is going to be able to pick it up and do some things. I think in the Liam Cohen offense, Travis Etienne is going to be the number 1 playmaker. They made it even more official by trading away Tank Bigsby to the Philadelphia Eagles today, which is crazy. So Etienne had 19 touches. Apparently, there was a lot of speculation. Was it going to be Etienne? Was it going to be Bigsby? Maybe even Bashal Tutin, the rookie coming in. And LaQuint Allen is even back there, got a few touches this week. But Travis Etienne was the bell cow. He had 19 touches, finished with 18.6 points for the RB6 last week. And Cincinnati-Jacksonville projects to be a high-scoring game. These two teams should go back and forth in a shootout. I think the Bengals look a lot better this week, and I think Travis Etienne remains the focal point for the Jacksonville Jaguars. My fade this week at running back, this was a little harder than I wanted it to be. I was trying to figure out who I wanted to fade. And like I said, I kind of went back and forth on this one as I did a few other fades, but I'm going to fade Ashton Jeanty this week. He is at home for the Las Vegas Raiders versus the Chargers. Jeanty finished as RB24 last week, so it wasn't a terrible showing. He was the back end of RB2s, barely an RB2. But I think this week the Chargers are going to come into this with a game plan, knowing that Jeanty is going to be the focal point for the Raiders. Harbaugh and company are going to have the defense keying in on him, and they're going to force Geno Smith to beat them through the air. I think Jeanty could get involved in the passing game some, and we probably see that blossom a little bit. But I think there's going to be a lot less running room for him. And I think, last week, the Chargers held the Chiefs running backs to 41 yards rushing. I think you're probably looking in that range again. So I don't think Jeanty cracks the RB1 ranks this week, and he's a fade for me. And let's move on to our wide receivers. Last week, we had a couple guys that actually hit for us pretty well. Cortland Sutton was there, and we had Puka Nacua hit in our top 12. And we also hit on a fade last week. We faded Tyreek Hill. I told you there's all kinds of reasons for that, and that fade worked out perfectly as Tyreek Hill finished as wide receiver 53 last week. That's pretty rough. My ranks coming into this week, there's really not a lot of change at the top, despite the way that certain players played. I've got Jamar Chase at number one. He's at home for Cincinnati versus the Jacksonville Jaguars, despite his wide receiver 74 finish last week. I've got Justin Jefferson at home for the Minnesota Vikings versus the Atlanta Falcons. He finished as wide receiver 20 last week. I've got Brian Thomas Jr. as wide receiver 3 this week at Cincinnati. He finished as wide receiver 42 last week. At number 4, I've got Malik Neighbors at Dallas this week for the New York Giants, and he finished as wide receiver 29 last week. At number 5, I've got CeeDee Lamb versus the New York Giants at home in Dallas. He finished as wide receiver 14 last week. At number 6, I've got Nico Collins at home for Houston versus the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, and he finished as wide receiver 64 last week. At number 7, I've got Amon-Ra St. Brown at home for the Detroit Lions versus the Chicago Bears, and he finished as wide receiver 47. At number 8 this week, I've got Puka Nacua, whose LA Rams are visiting the Tennessee Titans. Nacua, I've got him at 8 this week, wide receiver 8. He finished as wide receiver 5 last week. At number 9, I've got Jackson Smith-Njigba. He is traveling with the Seahawks to Pittsburgh this week and finished as wide receiver 11 last week. At number 10, I've got Ladd McConkey, whose Chargers are at Las Vegas this week visiting the Raiders. He finished as wide receiver 24 last week. At number 11 this week, I've got Garrett Wilson and the New York Jets, who are at home in New York versus the Buffalo Bills. He finished as wide receiver 7 last week. At number 12, I've got a guy that I've kept my eye on, all in, love him. I've got Emeka Egbuka at Houston for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers at number 12 this week in my rankings. He finished as wide receiver 4 last week. I would also want to throw a special shout out here of a quick note. Drake London, I would have had Drake London in my top 12 this week, but he suffered a shoulder sprain and is currently considered day-to-day. So he's kind of right there on that cusp. If he plays, he could creep up in there and try to get into that top 12 list. But as of right now, I'm really worried about that shoulder sprain. So if you're worried about London or, you wonder where to rank him, keep an eye on his shoulder this week in the injury reports and see how practices go in Atlanta. Two of the main guys I want to highlight here, we know the studs and stuff, and even the first guy he's a stud. It's Brian Thomas Jr. Most people have him below Chase, Jefferson, Neighbors, Lamb, that group, and, maybe even Amon-Ra. I think this week, again, Cincinnati versus Jacksonville is going to be a shootout, and I like Brian Thomas Jr. for a very, very high usage role, and I think he'll find the end zone in this shootout. I think he's going to get double-digit targets. And, last week, the Cincinnati Bengals gave up 4 receiving options with 8+ targets. Jacksonville is going to condense that for their top wide receiver group. I imagine you're going to see Brian Thomas Jr., Travis Hunter, and probably Brenton Strange get most of your looks in the passing game with ETN sprinkled in and maybe a couple other backs. But I think Brian Thomas Jr. eats this week at Cincinnati. My second guy, I mentioned him, put him at the wide receiver 12 spot, Emeka Egbuka. I don't know what else he could do. He's been fantastic. I loved him pre-draft. I loved his landing spot. I loved watching him in week 1, the way he operated. He seems to have all the physical skills. He's an immaculate route runner. He does everything he's supposed to do. He scored 23.6 points this past week. And it looks like they handpicked him and he just fell right into the Chris Godwin role. As long as Godwin is out, Godwin's injured, we're not expecting him back till at least probably week 6, maybe even later, depending on how they slow play it, which they may do with Egbuka being so well. And I don't know if anybody else caught this and saw some stuff. I saw some things on X, some posts and stuff, where Emeka called his own touchdown in the huddle before the game, what proved to be the game-winning touchdown. He called the play and said, "I'm going to game it," and it's over. And then he went and did it. So I don't know what else you need to do to like this guy. I imagine I've got him at 12 this week, had him just outside the top 12 last week. He's going to be a mainstay, I think, for me for this year, and barring some unforeseen accident or something happens. So just an amazing receiver. My wide receiver fade this week is Marvin Harrison Jr. He actually showed out, had a pretty good week, scored 18.1 points in week one. And this week he gets Carolina, and that's part of my fade. Harrison finished wide receiver 12 last week, so he was in the wide receiver one range. But I think a lot of that came from the fact that he was playing against the Saints. The Cardinals didn't, the offense wasn't really humming as much as they would like. I don't think they're going to have that problem against the Carolina Panthers. The Panthers' rush defense is one of the worst in the NFL and has been for the last year or so. I think James Conner and Trey Benson absolutely control the game flow against Carolina at home in Arizona, which means Harrison's not going to see a lot of volume. He didn't really see much volume last week. He had 6 targets, but he did maximize his scoring from those 6 targets, catching 5 of those passes, one of them being a big 45-yard bomb, and then later corralling a touchdown. I don't think he's going to be needed to do much of that. I don't think they may try to hit him with a deep shot here or there, but I think Carolina's main focus is going to be kind of taking that away, forcing them into a slower game, and I think Arizona's going to enjoy that with Connor and Benson leading the way. So I got Marvin Harrison Jr. as a fade at wide receiver. At tight end this week, we hit on a couple of players that I think some people weren't really expecting. Laporta was good. I think some people didn't know what to expect with him. We hit with him last week. We had Tyler Warren in the top 12 last week. I think there were a lot of people high on him, a lot of people low on him, didn't know exactly how that was going to work out. And he turned into an absolute centralized part of that Indianapolis Colts offense last week. And Daniel Jones keyed in on him, used him as his security blanket, and Tyler Warren kept the chains moving in an absolute rout of the Miami Dolphins. So that was a good hit. Our fade last week, if you'll remember, was Jake Ferguson, the tight end for the Dallas Cowboys. And, it turned out right. The Eagles were an extremely tough matchup. Ferguson ended up tight end 22. So, I mean, if you were in a 2 tight end league or doing something, maybe, but for the most part, he was a good fade last week and shouldn't have been in any rosters, especially in a 1 tight end league. For the overall rankings for week 2 for the tight ends, at number 1, I'm staying with the same as I have been. I think he's the number 1 tight end, and it's hard not to imagine he's not going to finish with more tight end 1 weeks than anybody else. Is Trey McBride at home for Arizona versus Carolina? He was tight end 12 last week. I know I said I kind of faded Harrison, but I think McBride gets more volume in that offense, so he'll be tight end 1, I believe. My second tight end of the week this week, and he gets the bump up from last week, and I think that Detroit wants to use him a little more, is Sam Laporta. He's going to be at home for the Lions versus Chicago, and if anybody really follows Jared Goff and follows the Lions, their offense is much smoother and usually runs a lot better at home. I think they're missing Ben Johnson this year, but I think they'll still be better at home. I've got Sam Laporta at tight end 2 this week. He was tight end 5 last week. At number 3, I've got Travis Kelce, the mainstay. He's not the same Travis Kelce he was before, but injuries and different things, and him still being Travis Kelce. He's at home for the Kansas City Chiefs against Philadelphia in that Super Bowl matchup. He finished tight end 8 last week. At number 4, I've got TJ Hawkinson at home for the Minnesota Vikings versus the Atlanta Falcons. He finished as tight end 31 last week. At number 5, I've got a guy who's consensusly, top tight end up there with McBride. Usually you hear about it. It's Brock Bowers, who's at home for the Las Vegas Raiders versus the Chargers. He was tight end 2 last week. Right behind Bowers, we've got the rookie, the guy that we had in the top 12 last weekend, and now we've got him at tight end 6 again this week. Is Tyler Warren versus the Denver Broncos at home at Indianapolis. He was tight end 3 last week. At number 7, Kyle Pitts Sr. at Minnesota for the Atlanta Falcons. He was tight end 7 last week, so I got him in the same spot that he finished up in last week. At number 8, I've got David Njoku, who is with the Cleveland Browns, who are visiting the Baltimore Ravens. Njoku was tight end 24 last week. Keep an eye on Harold Fannin Jr. I like him as a tight end. I almost ranked him in the top 12 this week, but I think him and Njoku play separate type of things. I think we're going to see some more Njoku this week. At number 9, I've got Dallas Goedert at Kansas City for the Philadelphia Eagles. He was tight end 14 last week. At number 10 for the tight ends this week, I've got Tucker Kraft for the Green Bay Packers at home versus the Washington Commanders. He was tight end 17 last week. At number 11, I've got Brenton Strange for the Jacksonville Jaguars at Cincinnati versus the Bengals. At tight end 12 and wrapping up the top tight ends of the week, I've got Hunter Henry for the New England Patriots at the Miami Dolphins this week. He was tight end 15 last week. Like the other positions, I want to highlight a couple of guys that, like I said, I kind of feel I'm higher on or lower on or whatnot, but they're definitely higher on here in my top rankings. My number 4 tight end this week is TJ Hockenson. As I mentioned before, he finished as tight end 31 last week. That was just yesterday, actually, the Minnesota Vikings versus Chicago Bears game. Anybody who watched the game, they watched McCarthy kind of slowly catch up. It felt like he was learning the speed of the NFL and kind of picking up things. Boy, the difference between night and day, first half to second half. McCarthy came out in the second half and looked like he commanded the offense, understood what he was doing, and made throws. He still didn't have a huge throwing day, didn't throw for over 200 yards or anything, didn't do any of that. But he led scoring drives and led the Vikings to a comeback. And I think a big part of that is going to be TJ Hockenson this week. As McCarthy gets more comfortable and he feels good about it, he's going to use Hockenson as a security blanket. He's still going to hit big plays with Jefferson. Still going to have, a couple of the other receivers in play. Adam Thielen had a big 2-point conversion last night. But I think we're going to see Hockenson as that security blanket. And we got to keep in mind, Jordan Addison still has 2 more games left on his suspension. So he won't be back until week 4. I always like Hockenson in any game that you can get for the Vikings with Addison out. Similar situation to Goddard and Devonta Smith for the Philadelphia Eagles. If one of them is out, the other one usually eats. So the Falcons gave up 3 touchdown passes this past week, and I think Hawk will get one this week. Like I said, I really feel like McCarthy will be targeting him and find him in the end zone. Another player that I'm high on, and I've seen the jokes on social media, seen the stuff. Hey, pull the blinds down. Everybody be quiet. Shh. Turn all the recording devices off. Make sure nothing's listening. Kyle Pitts might still be good. Shout out to Ian Hartitz for that. But, the whole point of this is Kyle Pitts, man. He's at tight end 7 for me. He's a physical specimen. We saw what he did as a rookie. And there's been question about, has he been banged up? Is he used right? What is that? Well, we watch him. He's fast. He's athletic. He has full skills on display. The pedigree is there. The draft capital is there. Everything's there. And he scored 12.9 points last week, finishes the tight end 7 on the week. So he's already back in tight end 1 status. He had 8 targets, 7 receptions, and 59 yards. He didn't even get into the end zone. So it's not one of those situations where it's like, oh, the touchdown propelled him into the top 12. He didn't even score. I think we could see a spike this week, especially if, as I mentioned earlier, Drake London with that shoulder sprain. If he were to miss this week and Mooney were to be out again, Darnell Mooney, who missed last week, the 2 top receiving options will be out. I think we could see an actual really, really good game for Kyle Pitts this week. And I mean, they're playing against the Vikings. They looked beatable against the tight end or by the tight ends. Cole Kmet had the longest reception for any Bears player last night at 31 yards. So I think Pitts could be in for a really big day. And like I said, I think I've got him locked in as a tight end 1 this week. We'll see how that plays out. There are a few notes on tight ends this week. And if you watch this and you check the rankings and stuff, it's been some form of Brock Bowers, Trey McBride, George Kittle. Switch them around how you want. That's the way people have been saying that. I am now, firm Trey McBride at the top of the list, but there's George Kittle news. He was injured this past week. He had a hamstring injury. He's now expected to miss at least 4 weeks as the 49ers have placed him on IR. So he's out at guaranteed the next 4 weeks. And I know, for anybody who drafted George Kittle, there's several replacements out there and different stuff on the wire. Jawan Johnson finishes the tight end 1 this past week in New Orleans. So there's a chance there. Harold Fannin Jr., who I mentioned earlier from the Browns, there's some availability. So I'm sure a lot of people are putting in waiver wire requests this week and putting in huge bids to try to fill their tight end spot where Kittle's going to be out. A second piece of information, similar to the Drake London, is Evan Ingram. He's got a calf injury. There's a possibility he may miss some time. There wasn't any news as of me recording this right now on whether he's missing time. As far as I couldn't find anything. So no news is hopefully good news. And I'll be honest, if I knew he was going to play this week, he would jump into my top 12 and maybe even as high as at 11 right there, 10 or 11 around Kraft or Strange, if I knew Evan Ingram was going to play this week. My tight end fade this week is one that kind of hurts a little bit. I've been on him for several years, and he's always been an old faithful for one of those. And he's one of the few tight ends that actually competed against Kelsey one year as a tight end one at the top of the overall list, is Mark Andrews for the Baltimore Ravens. The Ravens are at home this week, and they get the Cleveland Browns. And Andrews last week was tight end 49. So I faded Mark Andrews during draft season. I didn't target him in any drafts that I had, redraft, things like that. I actually traded him away in a couple dynasty leagues, and I've spoken on him a few times, wrote a few things about him. I'm a firm believer that his drop in the playoffs last year, whether it be a mental thing for him, whether it be a team trust thing, whatever it is, I feel like that was going to be a huge deal breaker. And you're talking about this past week in a shootout, 81 points scored. The Ravens lose to the Buffalo Bills 41-40. Mark Andrews, who we had seen as the core prime target for Lamar Jackson over the past several years, had one target. Sure, he caught it. Of course he did. He caught the one target for 5 yards. No touchdown, no anything else, but one target. That's all he had. Zay Flowers, Rashad Bateman, even DeAndre Hopkins, I feel like at this point, are all ahead of Andrews. And that's before we even get Isaiah Likely back. But specifically this week, I don't like the way I think Cleveland is going to get after Lamar Jackson. They actually showed a lot more fight in their game against Cincinnati this past week. They only lost by 1 point to the Cincinnati Bengals 17-16. So I think they're going to put up a huge fight against the Baltimore Ravens. And again, I don't think the Ravens and John Harbaugh and that group, I don't think they're designing plays for Andrews like he was. His actual skill set is kind of slightly declined. He looks like he's lost a step here and there. And like I said, I still think there's that mental block from that drop that he had in the playoffs last season. So there we have it, everybody. This is my week 2 offensive player rankings for IDP Plus. Be sure to give me a follow on X at JKeezy. Always available to talk football. I post articles and post a lot of football content and a lot of relatable stuff. Would love to follow you back. Let me know that you saw the video, and I'll definitely follow you back. Let me know who you like and who you don't like this week. Who are your fades? Who are your top 12? Is there any surprises that you see coming this week? Do we think week 2 is going to be as chaotic as week 1? Maybe so. Don't forget to check out all the great content at IDP Plus. A lot of great videos, a lot of great content going out. So much good stuff there. Also over at Big Guy Fantasy Sports, I've got articles there as well and stuff posted there. So guys, check this stuff out. It's huge for you. It's going to give you an advantage in every league that you're in. And until next time, good luck on your waiver wires. Good luck on this week. And let's win some fantasy.
Thank you for watching the IDP Plus YouTube network. If you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Be sure to tap the bell icon to get notified whenever we upload new content.